Welcome to the extraordinary story of Massachusetts, a small state with an outsized impact on American and world history. From the rocky shores where the Mayflower first anchored to the battlefields where American independence was born, to the mills that sparked the Industrial Revolution and the laboratories that today push the boundaries of human knowledge, Massachusetts has been at the center of transformative moments for over 4 centuries. This is more than just the history of a state. It's the story of radical ideas, revolutionary thinkers, and resilient communities that have repeatedly changed the course of human events. So, let's journey through time and discover how this corner of New England became one of the most influential places on Earth. The first people, 10,000 BCE, 1600 CE. Long before European sails appeared on the horizon, Massachusetts was home to thriving indigenous civilizations. For over 12,000 years, native peoples shaped this land, developing sophisticated societies that would profoundly influence the region's future. The Massachusett, Wampanoag, Nipmuc, Pocumtuc, and Mahican peoples, among others, inhabited different regions of what we now call Massachusetts. These weren't primitive societies. They had complex political structures, extensive trade networks reaching as far as the Great Lakes, and sophisticated agricultural systems. They cultivated the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash, in an ingenious companion planting system that enriched the soil and maximized yields. The Wampanoag alone numbered around 40,000 people in 69 villages before European contact. They had a democratic political system where sachems, or chiefs, ruled with the consent of their people. Their society was matrilineal, with property and political power often passing through the female line. These peoples managed the forests through controlled burning, creating the park-like landscapes that would later amaze European settlers. They built sophisticated fish weirs in rivers, developed detailed astronomical knowledge, and created wampum, intricately crafted shell beads that served as both ceremonial objects and currency throughout the Northeast. But between 1616 and 1619, a catastrophic epidemic, likely viral hepatitis or leptospirosis brought by European traders, killed an estimated 90% of the coastal native population. Entire villages were wiped out, leaving cleared fields and empty settlements that would soon be occupied by English colonists. This demographic disaster would fundamentally alter the balance of power in the region. First encounters and early colonization, 1600, 1630. The first documented European explorer to reach Massachusetts was Bartholomew Gosnold in 1602, who named Cape Cod for the abundant fish in its waters. Samuel de Champlain mapped the coast in 1605 and 1606. But it was Captain John Smith's 1614 voyage that would have the most lasting impact. Smith coined the name New England and created detailed maps that would guide future colonists. The story everyone knows begins on November 11th, 1620, when the Mayflower dropped anchor in Provincetown Harbor. But this familiar tale deserves a closer look. The 102 passengers aboard weren't all pilgrims. Only about half were religious separatists fleeing persecution. The rest, whom the pilgrims called strangers, were fortune seekers, servants, and soldiers. These groups nearly came to blows before even landing. To prevent chaos, they drafted the Mayflower Compact, a simple document that would have profound implications. By agreeing to covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic, they established the principle of government by the consent of the governed, a radical idea that would echo through American history. The Pilgrims' first winter was devastating. They had arrived too late to plant crops, and disease ravaged the colony. By spring, half were dead. The colony might have perished entirely if not for Tisquantum, known as Squanto, a Patuxet man who had been enslaved, taken to Europe, learned English, and managed to return home only to find his entire village dead from disease. His decision to help the struggling colonists would change history. Working with Massachusett, the Wampanoag sachem, who saw the English as potential allies against his enemies, Squanto taught the colonists how to fertilize corn with fish, where to hunt and fish, and how to navigate local politics. The alliance between the Plymouth colony and the Wampanoag, sealed with a treaty that lasted 54 years, ensured the colony's survival. But Plymouth was just the beginning. In 1628, a group of Puritan investors established a small settlement at Salem. This would become the seed of something much larger, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which would transform New England and establish patterns that would shape American culture for centuries to come. The Puritan Commonwealth, 1630-1660. In 1630, John Winthrop stood aboard the ship Arbella and delivered one of the most influential speeches in American history. "We shall be as a city upon a hill," he declared. "The eyes of all people are upon us." With these words, he articulated a vision of Massachusetts as a model society that would inspire the world, an idea that still resonates in American political rhetoric today. The Puritan migration that followed was unprecedented. Between 1630 and 1640, over 20,000 English Puritans arrived in Massachusetts, not fleeing poverty, but leaving comfortable middle-class lives to build their religious utopia. They brought entire families, tools, livestock, and books. They established towns with remarkable speed: Boston, Cambridge, Roxbury, Dorchester, Watertown, and Charlestown, all founded within months. The Puritans created what was, for its time, a remarkably advanced society. They established Harvard College in 1636, just 6 years after Boston's founding, to ensure an educated ministry. They created the first public school system in America, mandating that every town with 50 families hire a teacher and every town with 100 families establish a grammar school. Their literacy rate was probably the highest in the world, but this was also a theocracy that tolerated no dissent. Roger Williams was banished for arguing for religious tolerance and separation of church and state. He would go on to found Rhode Island. Anne Hutchinson was exiled for holding religious meetings in her home and challenging ministerial authority. Quakers were whipped, branded, and even executed. The Puritan economy thrived through a combination of farming, fishing, and trade. They built ships, exported timber and fish to the Caribbean, and imported sugar and molasses. The triangular trade that would later include enslaved Africans was already taking shape. By 1660, Massachusetts had become the commercial hub of New England, with Boston emerging as one of the British Empire's most important ports. The Puritans' relationship with native peoples was complex and ultimately tragic. While they initially maintained alliances and engaged in trade, their relentless expansion and cultural imperialism created mounting tensions. Puritan missionaries, like John Eliot, established praying towns for Christian converts, but these represented cultural destruction as much as religious conversion. King Philip's War and colonial consolidation, 1660 and 1700, the uneasy peace between colonists and native peoples shattered in 1675 with King Philip's War, proportionally the bloodiest conflict in American history. Metacomet, known to the English as King Philip, son of Massachusett, led a confederation of tribes in a desperate attempt to drive out the colonists. The war was brutal beyond imagination. Entire towns were burned, Deerfield, Brookfield, and Springfield among them. The colonists responded with equal savagery, selling captured native peoples into slavery in the Caribbean and mounting Metacomet's head on a pike in Plymouth, where it remained for 25 years. When the war ended in 1676, 600 colonists and 3,000 native people were dead, 5% and 40% of their respective populations. The war shattered native power in southern New England permanently, opening vast territories for colonial expansion. But it also nearly bankrupted the colonies and left deep psychological scars that would influence American attitudes toward frontier warfare for generations. The aftermath brought major political changes. In 1684, England revoked Massachusetts' charter, and in 1686 combined it with other colonies into the Dominion of New England under Royal Governor Edmund Andros. The Puritans, who had governed themselves for 50 years, suddenly found themselves under direct royal control. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 in England provided an opportunity. Bostonians arrested Andros and seized control. The new charter of 1691 restored self-government, but with crucial changes. Voting rights were now based on property rather than church membership, and the governor would be appointed by the crown. The Puritan theocracy was ending, replaced by a more secular, commercial society. This period also saw the Salem witch trials of 1692-1693, perhaps the most infamous episode in colonial Massachusetts history. 20 people were executed and dozens more imprisoned based on spectral evidence and mass hysteria. The trials represented both the last gasp of Puritan extremism and a cautionary tale about justice and due process that still resonates today. The Commercial Revolution, 1700 to 1750, the 18th century transformed Massachusetts from a religious commonwealth into a commercial powerhouse. Boston became British America's largest city, with nearly 17,000 inhabitants by 1750. The city's merchants grew wealthy through trade, shipbuilding, and rum distillation. The triangular trade reached its full development. New England ships carried rum to Africa, traded it for enslaved people, transported them to the Caribbean, and returned with molasses to make more rum. While Massachusetts never had large-scale plantation slavery, its economy was deeply entangled with the slave trade. Ships built in Massachusetts carried hundreds of thousands of enslaved Africans across the Atlantic. This era saw the rise of a merchant aristocracy. Families like the Hancocks, Faneuils, and Hutchinsons, who built grand houses on Beacon Hill and dominated political life. They imported luxury goods from England, drank tea from Chinese porcelain, and wore the latest London fashions. But prosperity wasn't limited to Boston. Fishing towns like Marblehead and Gloucester thrived. The Connecticut River Valley became a fertile agricultural region. Worcester emerged as an inland commercial center. The colony's population grew from 56,000 in 1700 to 235,000 by 1750. Intellectually, Massachusetts was experiencing its own enlightenment. Harvard College evolved from a Puritan seminary into a center of scientific learning. Ministers like Jonathan Edwards combined Calvinist theology with Enlightenment philosophy. Benjamin Franklin, born in Boston in 1706, embodied the new spirit of scientific inquiry and practical innovation. though he would make his mark in Philadelphia. The Great Awakening of the 1740s, led by preachers like George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards, challenged established religious authority and democratized religious experience. It split congregations, weakened the established church, and promoted individualism, preparing the ground for political revolution. The Road to Revolution, 1750 1775. The French and Indian War, 1754 1763, marked a turning point. Massachusetts contributed more troops and money than any other colony. Young men like Israel Putnam and John Stark gained military experience that would prove valuable later. The war's end removed the French threat, making colonists less dependent on British protection. But victory brought new tensions. Britain's war debt led to new taxes, and Massachusetts became the center of resistance. The Sugar Act of 1764 threatened the molasses trade. The Stamp Act of 1765 sparked riots in Boston. A mob destroyed Lieutenant Governor Thomas Hutchinson's house. The phrase, "no taxation without representation," became a rallying cry. Boston's radical politics were driven by an unusual coalition. Wealthy merchants like John Hancock, middle-class artisans organized by Samuel Adams, and working-class crowds ready for direct action. The Sons of Liberty, founded in 1765, coordinated resistance throughout the colonies. The Townshend Acts of 1767 brought British troops to Boston. On March 5, 1770, tensions exploded in the Boston Massacre when British soldiers killed 5 colonists. John Adams' successful defense of the soldiers showed commitment to rule of law, but Paul Revere's inflammatory engraving ensured the incident became revolutionary propaganda. The Tea Act of 1773 triggered the most famous act of resistance. On December 16th, Samuel Adams organized the Boston Tea Party, dumping 342 chests of tea worth $10,000 into the harbor. Britain's response, the coercive acts that closed Boston's port and revoked Massachusetts' charter, united the colonies in support of Massachusetts. In 1774, Massachusetts created the Provincial Congress, a shadow government that collected taxes and organized militia. General Thomas Gage, the British military governor, controlled only Boston. The countryside was effectively in rebellion. Towns began drilling their militia more seriously, gathering arms and powder. By early 1775, everyone knew conflict was coming. The only questions were when and where it would begin. The Revolutionary War, 1783. The American Revolution began in Massachusetts on April 19, 75. General Gage sent 700 troops to seize colonial weapons at Concord. Paul Revere and William Dawes rode to warn the countryside. At Lexington Green, 77 militiamen faced the British regulars. Someone fired. The shot heard round the world, leaving 8 Americans dead. But at Concord, the tables turned. Hundreds of militiamen converged on the town. At the North Bridge, they stood their ground and fired back. As the British retreated to Boston, colonial militia poured fire into their ranks from behind stone walls and trees. By day's end, 273 British and 95 Americans were casualties. The war had begun. Within days, 20,000 militia surrounded Boston, beginning a siege that would last nearly a year. At Bunker Hill on June 17, 1795, colonial forces inflicted devastating casualties on British regulars before retreating. The British won the hill, but lost 1,054 men. The colonials lost 450, but proved they could stand against professional soldiers. George Washington arrived in Cambridge on July 3, 1775, to take command. He faced enormous challenges. No gunpowder, no artillery, soldiers whose enlistments were expiring, and no money to pay them. The solution came from an unlikely source, Henry Knox, a Boston bookseller who proposed retrieving captured British cannon from Fort Ticonderoga. In an epic feat of logistics, Knox's men dragged 59 cannons, weighing 120,000 pounds, across 300 miles of winter terrain. When these guns appeared on Dorchester Heights on March 5, 1776, the British position became untenable. On March 17th, still celebrated as Evacuation Day in Boston, the British fleet sailed away, never to return. Massachusetts' contribution to the Revolutionary War extended far beyond these early battles. The state provided more soldiers per capita than any other. Its shipyards built Continental Navy vessels. Its privateers, essentially legalized pirates, captured over 600 British ships, contributing more to the war effort than the Continental Navy. The war transformed Massachusetts society. Women managed farms and businesses. African Americans, both enslaved and free, served in the military. Massachusetts regiments were among the most integrated. Towns went into debt to pay soldier bonuses. The old social hierarchy weakened as common soldiers demanded respect and political participation. Building a new nation, 1780-1820, even during war, Massachusetts was building new governmental structures. The state constitution of 1780, primarily written by John Adams, became a model for other states and influenced the federal constitution. It included a Bill of Rights, separation of powers, and the revolutionary statement that all men are born free and equal. This period saw the gradual end of slavery in Massachusetts. The Constitution's Equality Clause, combined with legal cases like Quackwalker v. Jennison, 1783, effectively abolished slavery through judicial interpretation, making Massachusetts the first state to end the practice entirely. Shays' Rebellion of 1786-1787 exposed the new nation's weaknesses. Revolutionary War veteran Daniel Shays led thousands of debt-ridden farmers in an uprising against foreclosures and tax collections. They shut down courts and nearly seized the federal arsenal at Springfield. The rebellion's suppression required a privately funded army, highlighting the need for a stronger federal government and influencing the Constitutional Convention. Massachusetts ratified the federal Constitution in 1788, but only by 187-168, and only after Federalists promised to add a Bill of Rights. The state's politicians would dominate early national politics. John Adams became the second president, John Hancock the first president of the Continental Congress, and Massachusetts men filled cabinet positions and the federal judiciary. The Federalist Party, strongest in Massachusetts, promoted manufacturing, banking, and commerce. Boston's merchants grew wealthy in the China trade, sending ships around Cape Horn to the Pacific Northwest for furs, then to Canton for tea, silk, and porcelain. Salem briefly rivaled Boston as a port, with its merchants opening trade with India and Southeast Asia. The War of 1812 devastated Massachusetts' commerce, but accelerated industrialization. The Embargo Act and War cut off British manufactured goods, forcing Americans to develop their own industries. Francis Cabot Lowell traveled to Britain, memorized power loom designs, and returned to build America's first integrated textile mill in Waltham in 1814. The Industrial Revolution, 1820-1860, Massachusetts, became the birthplace of American industrialization. The Boston Associates, building on Lowell's innovations, created entire industrial cities. Lowell, founded in 1826, became the model, a planned city with mills, boarding houses, churches, and schools. By 1840, Lowell's mills employed 8,000 workers. mostly young women from rural New England. The Lowell system was initially paternalistic but relatively benign. Mill girls lived in supervised boarding houses, attended lectures, published their own magazine, and earned wages that gave them unprecedented independence. But as competition increased, conditions deteriorated, hours lengthened, wages fell, and the mill girls were gradually replaced by Irish immigrants fleeing famine. The Irish immigration of the 1840s and 1850s transformed Massachusetts. Boston's population exploded from 61,000 in 1830 to 178,000 in 1860, with the Irish comprising over a third. They faced vicious discrimination. No Irish need apply signs were common, but they built communities, churches, and political organizations that would eventually capture Boston's political machinery. Meanwhile, Massachusetts became the center of American intellectual and cultural life. The Transcendentalist movement, centered in Concord, included Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, and Margaret Fuller. They promoted individualism, intuition over reason, and harmony with nature. Thoreau's civil disobedience would inspire Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. Boston became the Athens of America. The Boston Public Library, founded in 1848, was America's first large municipal library. The city boasted multiple theaters, lecture halls, and literary societies. Publishers like Ticknor and Fields made Boston the nation's publishing capital. This era also saw Massachusetts lead numerous reform movements. Horace Mann revolutionized public education, creating the model for American public schools. Dorothea Dix reformed treatment of the mentally ill. The temperance movement gained massive support. The state passed America's first comprehensive child labor laws. Most significantly, Massachusetts became the center of the abolitionist movement. William Lloyd Garrison's newspaper, The Liberator, founded in 1831, demanded immediate emancipation. Frederick Douglass made his first public speeches in Massachusetts. The Underground Railroad ran through numerous Massachusetts towns. When the Fugitive Slave Act passed in 1850, Massachusetts essentially nullified it, making slave catching nearly impossible. The Civil War and its aftermath, 1860-1900. When the Civil War began, Massachusetts responded with overwhelming enthusiasm. Governor John Andrew, a radical Republican, had secretly been preparing for war. Massachusetts troops were the first to respond to Lincoln's call. The 6th Massachusetts Regiment was attacked by pro-Confederate mobs in Baltimore on April 19, 1861, suffering the war's first casualties. Massachusetts contributed 160,000 soldiers and sailors, 12% of its population. The state's most famous unit was the 54th Massachusetts Infantry, one of the first African American regiments, led by Robert Gould Shaw. Their brave assault on Fort Wagner, though unsuccessful, proved African Americans' military capability and helped transform the war into a fight for emancipation. The war accelerated Massachusetts' industrial development. Factories ran at full capacity, producing uniforms, shoes, rifles, and ammunition. The demand for labor drew more immigrants and women into factories. Fortunes were made, and sometimes lost, in war contracts. After the war, Massachusetts experienced unprecedented industrial growth. Cities like Lawrence, Fall River, and New Bedford became textile powerhouses. Worcester became a center for machinery and tools. Lynn dominated shoe production. By 1890, Massachusetts produced more manufactured goods per capita than any other state. This industrial boom came at a human cost. Workers labored 10 to 12 hours daily in dangerous conditions. Child labor was common, despite laws. Workers organized. The Knights of Labor, and later the American Federation of Labor, gained strength. Strikes became frequent and sometimes violent, like the 1912 Bread and Roses strike in Lawrence. Immigration transformed the state's demographics. Irish immigrants gained political power. Hugh O'Brien became Boston's first Irish Catholic mayor in 1885. Italians, Portuguese, Poles, French Canadians, and Eastern European Jews arrived in waves. Each group faced discrimination, but gradually built communities and gained influence. The Gilded Age created vast wealth disparities. Boston Brahmins, old Protestant families, controlled banks, industries, and cultural institutions. They built palatial cottages in the Berkshires and on the North Shore. Meanwhile, immigrants crowded into tenements in Boston's North and West Ends. Education expanded dramatically. MIT, founded in 1861, pioneered engineering education. Boston University, Northeastern, Boston College, and other institutions were established. Women's colleges like Wellesley, Smith, and Mount Holyoke offered women unprecedented educational opportunities. The Progressive Era and World Wars, 1900, 1945, the 20th century, began with Massachusetts at the forefront of the progressive movement. The state passed pioneering legislation, the first minimum wage law for women and children, 1912, workers' compensation, 1911, and direct election of senators, 1913. Louis Brandeis, before joining the Supreme Court, developed legal arguments defending such reforms. The 1912 Lawrence textile strike, known as the Bread and Roses strike, captured national attention. When mill owners cut wages after the state reduced working hours, 20,000 workers, mostly immigrant women, struck. The industrial workers of the world organized the strike, demanding not just fair wages, bread, but dignity, roses. After 2 months and national publicity about police violence against strikers, workers won significant concessions. World War I transformed Massachusetts' economy and society. Shipyards operated around the clock. Factories converted to war production. The Watertown Arsenal developed new manufacturing techniques. About 200,000 Massachusetts men served, with 5,000 killed. The war's aftermath brought turmoil. The 1919 Boston police strike, when 75% of officers walked out over wages and working conditions, led to riots and looting. Governor Calvin Coolidge's firm response, "There is no right to strike against the public safety," launched him toward the presidency. The 1920s saw cultural conflicts. The Sacco and Vanzetti case became an international cause célèbre. The two Italian anarchists, convicted of murder on questionable evidence, were executed in 1927 despite worldwide protests. The case exposed ethnic and political prejudices in Massachusetts justice. Prohibition barely affected Massachusetts. The state had narrowly voted against prohibition, and enforcement was lackadaisical. Speakeasies operated openly in Boston. Joseph P. Kennedy, father of the future president, allegedly made his fortune in bootlegging. The Great Depression hit Massachusetts hard. By 1932, unemployment reached 30%. Textile mills fled south, seeking cheaper labor. Shoe factories closed. Cities like Lowell and Lawrence seemed to be dying. Only federal New Deal programs, the WPA, CCC, and PWA, provided relief. Building schools, parks, and infrastructure still used today. World War II revived Massachusetts' economy. The state became a center for military technology. MIT's radiation laboratory developed radar. Raytheon mass-produced magnetron tubes. Shipyards in Quincy and Boston built destroyers and landing craft. Women entered factories in unprecedented numbers. By war's end, Massachusetts had transformed from a declining textile producer to a high-tech leader. The post-war transformation, 1945-1980. The post-war era brought dramatic changes. The GI Bill sent thousands to Massachusetts universities, making Boston the world's largest college town. Route 128, America's first circumferential highway, became America's technology highway as MIT spin-offs and defense contractors clustered along it. The 1950s seemed prosperous, but underlying problems festered. Old industries continued declining. Urban renewal destroyed established neighborhoods. Boston's West End was demolished, displacing 20,000 people. Highways carved through cities. Middle-class families fled to suburbs, leaving cities with declining tax bases and concentrated poverty. The Kennedy family emerged as Massachusetts' political dynasty. John F. Kennedy's election as president in 1960 marked Irish Catholic America's full acceptance. His assassination in 1963 traumatized the state. His brothers Robert and Edward continued the family's political influence, with Ted Kennedy serving in the Senate for 47 years. The 1960s brought social upheaval. The civil rights movement exposed Boston's deep racial divisions. Despite Massachusetts's abolitionist history, Boston was highly segregated. Martin Luther King Jr. called Boston the most racist city he'd visited after leading a march in 1965. The Boston school desegregation crisis of 1974-1976 tore the city apart. Federal Judge Arthur Garrity ordered busing to integrate schools. White resistance in South Boston and Charlestown was fierce. Buses were stoned, riots erupted, and the National Guard was deployed. The crisis accelerated white flight and damaged Boston's reputation for decades. Meanwhile, Massachusetts pioneered social reforms. The state liberalized abortion laws before Roe v. Wade, abolished capital punishment, and implemented pioneering mental health and special education reforms. Michael Dukakis, as governor, promoted the state's first comprehensive environmental protections. The Vietnam War divided the state. Massachusetts had more conscientious objectors per capita than any state. Anti-war protests filled Boston Common, yet working-class communities sent their sons to fight in disproportionate numbers, creating lasting social tensions. The 1970s economic crisis hit hard. The oil embargo devastated energy-dependent industries. Unemployment soared. New York City's near bankruptcy scared investors away from northeastern cities. By 1975, Massachusetts seemed to be in terminal decline. The Massachusetts Miracle, 1980-2000. The 1980s brought an unexpected renaissance, dubbed the Massachusetts Miracle. The computer revolution centered on Route 128. Companies like Digital Equipment Corporation and Wang Laboratories created thousands of jobs. MIT and Harvard spawned countless startups. Unemployment dropped from 12% to 3%. Governor Michael Dukakis promoted the state as a high-tech leader. The boom seemed to validate the idea that education and innovation could replace manufacturing. But the miracle proved fragile. When the mini-computer industry collapsed around 1990, replaced by personal computers made elsewhere, Massachusetts fell into severe recession. Recovery came through diversification. Biotechnology, pioneered by companies like Genzyme and Biogen, emerged from university research. Mutual fund companies like Fidelity Investments made Boston a financial services center. Hospitals became economic engines, with Massachusetts General, Brigham and Women's, and others attracting patients worldwide. The Central Artery Tunnel Project, known as the Big Dig, began in 1991. This massive undertaking to bury Boston's elevated highway underground became the most expensive highway project in U.S. history, plagued by delays, cost overruns, and scandals. Yet when completed, it transformed Boston, reconnecting neighborhoods and creating parks. Higher education continued growing. Boston's 50-plus colleges and universities enrolled over 250,000 students, making education the city's largest industry. The concentration of young, educated people created a culture of innovation and entrepreneurship. Healthcare reform became Massachusetts' signature issue. After several failed attempts, the state passed universal health care under Governor Mitt Romney in 2006. This bipartisan achievement, requiring all residents to have health insurance, became the model for the Affordable Care Act. Immigration again transformed Massachusetts. Unlike earlier waves, post 1965 immigrants came from everywhere: Brazil, China, India, Vietnam, Haiti, Central America. By 2000, 1 in 8 Massachusetts residents was foreign born. Cities like Lowell and Lawrence, once dying, were revitalized by immigrant entrepreneurs. The 21st century and beyond, 2000 to present, the new millennium brought new challenges and opportunities. The dot-com crash of 2000 hit Massachusetts' tech sector hard, but the state recovered faster than most. The September 11th attacks, with both planes departing from Logan Airport, deeply affected the state. Security measures transformed air travel, while the deaths of 206 Massachusetts residents in the attacks left lasting scars. Massachusetts emerged as America's most liberal state, pioneering social changes that would later spread nationwide. In 2003, the Supreme Judicial Court's Goodridge decision made Massachusetts the first state to legalize same-sex marriage. Despite fierce opposition and predictions of social collapse, the sky didn't fall, and other states gradually followed. The 2008 financial crisis tested the state's resilience. While devastated regions never fully recovered from deindustrialization, Greater Boston's diverse economy, education, healthcare, technology, finance, proved remarkably resilient. The recession accelerated economic divergence between thriving Metro Boston and struggling former mill cities. The biotech boom accelerated, with Cambridge's Kendall Square becoming the world's densest concentration of biotechnology companies. The Human Genome Project's completion, COVID vaccine development, and breakthrough therapies for previously untreatable diseases established Massachusetts as the global capital of life sciences. Climate change became an urgent priority. Massachusetts set ambitious carbon reduction goals, promoted offshore wind development, and sued the federal government to regulate greenhouse gases. Rising sea levels and stronger storms threaten Boston's waterfront, prompting massive resilience planning. The innovation economy created unprecedented wealth, but also inequality. By 2020, Greater Boston had some of America's highest housing costs. Young families and essential workers were priced out. Gateway cities like Worcester, Lowell, and Springfield offered more affordable alternatives, but struggled with inadequate transit connections. Recent years have brought racial reckonings. The 2020 George Floyd protests prompted re-examination of Massachusetts's racial history and persistent disparities. Despite the state's progressive reputation, wealth gaps between white and black families remain among the nation's largest. The COVID-19 pandemic tested Massachusetts severely. The state's world-class hospitals became models for treatment, and its biotech companies developed vaccines and treatments. But the pandemic exposed inequalities. Frontline workers, disproportionately people of color, faced highest risks, while knowledge workers worked safely from home. The Massachusetts legacy, as we conclude this journey through Massachusetts history, what emerges is a story of constant transformation and enduring influence. From Puritan Commonwealth to commercial hub, from industrial powerhouse to innovation economy, Massachusetts has repeatedly reinvented itself while maintaining core values: education, innovation, and civic engagement. The state's contributions to American and world history are immeasurable. It gave birth to American democracy, public education, and industrial development. It led the fights against slavery, for workers' rights, and for universal health care. Its universities and hospitals push the boundaries of human knowledge. Its companies develop technologies that transform how we live. But Massachusetts history also offers cautionary lessons: the displacement of native peoples, the profits from slave trading, the exploitation of industrial workers, and persistent racial and economic inequalities remind us that progress often comes at terrible cost. The state's history of reform is also a history of the need for reform. Today's Massachusetts faces familiar challenges in new forms: how to maintain economic dynamism while ensuring broad prosperity, how to preserve historic communities while accommodating growth, how to honor the past while building the future. These questions have no easy answers, but Massachusetts's history suggests the state will continue adapting and leading. The Puritan ideal of the city upon a hill still resonates, though transformed beyond John Winthrop's imagination. Modern Massachusetts isn't a religious utopia, but a diverse, dynamic society where people of all backgrounds contribute to ongoing experiments in technology, medicine, education, and governance. From the Wampanoag teaching pilgrims to survive, to Irish politicians capturing Boston's mayoralty, to Cambodian refugees revitalizing Lowell, to Indian engineers innovating in Kendall Square. Massachusetts' story is one of successive waves of newcomers adding their chapters to an ever-evolving narrative. As we look to the future, Massachusetts' history suggests reasons for both optimism and caution. The state's capacity for innovation and adaptation remains strong. Its educational institutions, entrepreneurial culture, and civic traditions provide solid foundations. But success isn't guaranteed. History shows that economic and social leadership can be lost as well as won. What seems certain is that Massachusetts will continue to matter. In an age of global challenges, climate change, pandemic disease, artificial intelligence, biotechnology, the state's concentration of scientific, medical, and technical expertise ensures its continued relevance. The next chapters of Massachusetts history are being written in laboratory notebooks, policy proposals, and startup business plans across the Commonwealth. The story of Massachusetts reminds us that history isn't just about the past, it's about understanding how we got here and imagining where we might go. From those first native inhabitants managing the land sustainably to today's scientists developing sustainable technologies, Massachusetts has been a place where people have tried to build better futures. This small state, just 10,565 square miles, has produced ideas and innovations that change the world. Its history is America's history in microcosm. with all the triumphs, failures, conflicts, and achievements that implies. As Massachusetts continues forward, it carries this complex legacy, using lessons from 4 centuries of history to navigate an uncertain but promising future. The story of Massachusetts is far from over. Each generation adds new chapters, facing new challenges with tools and wisdom inherited from the past. What remains constant is the spirit of innovation, education, and engagement that has defined Massachusetts from its earliest days. That spirit, more than any particular industry or institution, may be Massachusetts' most important contribution to America and the world.